But when the enemy's refusal compelled him to seek for new glory and to form a more just estimate of his own force, he totally altered his opinions and declared himself favourable to the occupation of Egypt, and this had even become the general sentiment of the army. He now thought only of maintaining himself in the country. He dismissed those who had influenced him in forming his first design, and collected around him only those who favoured the contrary measure. Had he lived, Egypt would have been secure. To his death, her loss must be attributed. The command of the army was afterwards divided between Menou and Regnier. It then became a mere field of intrigue. The energy and courage of the French troops continued unabated, but they were no longer employed and directed as they had been by Kleber. Menou was totally inefficient. The English advanced to attack him with 20,000 men. His force was much more considerable, and the general spirit of the two armies was not to be compared. By an inconceivable infatuation, Menou hastily dispersed his troops as soon as he learned that the English were about to appear. The latter advanced in a mass and were attacked only in detail. "How blind is fortune," said the emperor. "By the adoption of contrary measures, the English would infallibly have been destroyed, and how many new chances might not that event have brought about?" "Their landing was admirable," said the Grand Marshal. "In less than 5 or 6 minutes, 5,500 men appeared in the order of battle. It was a truly theatrical movement, and it was thrice repeated. Their landing was opposed by only 1,200 men, who did them considerable damage." Shortly after, this mass, amounting to between 13,000 and 14,000, was intrepidly attacked by General Lanous. The general had only 3,000 troops, but fired with ambition, and not doubting that his force was adequate to fulfill the object he had in view, he would not wait for reinforcements. At first he overthrew everything in his way, and after causing immense slaughter to the enemy, he was at length defeated. Had his force been 2,000 or 3,000 stronger, he would have attained his object. The English were greatly astonished when they had an opportunity of judging for themselves of our real situation in Egypt, and they considered themselves extremely fortunate in the turn which affairs had taken. General Hutchinson, who reaped the glory of the conquest, said, on his return to Europe, that had the English known the real state of things, they would certainly never have attempted to land, but in England it was believed that there were not 6,000 French troops in Egypt. This mistake arose out of the intercepted letters, as well as the intelligence that was collected in Egypt. "So natural is it to Frenchmen," said Napoleon, "to exaggerate, murmur, and misrepresent when they are dissatisfied. These reports, however, were created merely by ill humour or diseased imaginations. It was said that there was a famine in Egypt, that the French had all been destroyed at every new battle, that the plague had swept away the whole army, that there was not a man left." Through the repetition of these reports, Pitt was at length persuaded of their reality, and how could it be otherwise? The first consul saw the dispatches from his successor addressed to the Directory, and also letters from various persons in the French army. Who can explain the contradictions they contained? Who will henceforth trust to individual authority for the support of his opinion? Kleber, the general-in-chief, informed the Directory that he had only 6,000 men, while in the same packet the accounts of the Inspectorate reviews exhibited upwards of 20,000. Kleber declared that he was without money, and the treasury accounts display vast sums. The general-in-chief alleged that the artillery was merely an entrenched park, destitute of ammunition, while the estimates of that department made mention of provisions for several campaigns. Thus, if Kleber, by virtue of the treaty he commenced, had evacuated Egypt, said the emperor, I should undoubtedly have brought him to trial on his return to France. All these contradictory documents had been submitted to the examination and opinion of the Council of State. From the letters of Kleber, the general-in-chief, an idea may be formed of the tone of those written by persons of inferior rank and by the common soldiers. Such, however, were the communications daily intercepted by the English, which they printed and which guided them in their operations, a circumstance that must frequently have led them into grievous errors. The emperor observed that in all his campaigns he had seen the same effect produced by intercepted letters, which sometimes had proved of great advantage to him. Among the letters which at this period fell into his hands, he found odious attacks upon himself, which he felt the more sensibly, because several of them were written by persons whom he had loaded with benefits, in whom he had reposed full confidence, and whom he believed to be strongly attached to him. One of these individuals, whose fortune he had made, and in whom he trusted with the utmost sincerity, alleged that the general-in-chief had decamped after robbing the treasury of 2 millions. Fortunately, in these same dispatches, the accounts at the paymaster proved that the general had not even received the whole amount of the pay due to him. "On reading this statement," said the emperor, "I felt really disgusted at mankind. This was the first moral revulsion I had ever experienced, and if it has not been the only one, it has, perhaps, been at least the most severe. Many individuals in the army thought me ruined, and they were already eagerly seeking to pay their court in the proper quarter at my expense." The author of the assertion above alluded to subsequently endeavoured to restore himself to favour. The emperor signified that he should have no objection to his being employed in a subordinate situation, but that he would never see him again. To every application he constantly replied that he did not know him, this was the only vengeance he took. The emperor never ceased to repeat that Egypt ought to have remained in the possession of the French, which would infallibly have been the case had the country been defended by Kleber or Desire. "These were my 2 most distinguished lieutenants," said he. "Both possessed great and rare merits, though their characters and dispositions were very different. Their portraits will be found in the memoirs of the campaign of Italy. Kleber's was the talent of nature, Desire's was entirely the result of education and assiduity. The genius of Kleber was only called forth at particular moments, when roused by the importance of the occasion, and then it immediately slumbered in the bosom of indolence and pleasure. The talent of Desire was always in full activity. He lived only for noble ambition and true glory. His character was formed on the true ancient model. The emperor said that his death was the greatest loss he could possibly have sustained. Their conformity of education and principles would always have preserved a good understanding between them. Desire would have been satisfied with secondary rank and would have remained ever devoted and faithful. Had he not been killed at the Battle of Marengo, the first consul would have given him the command of the army of Germany, instead of continuing it to Moreau. A very extraordinary circumstance in the destiny of these 2 lieutenants of Napoleon was, that on the very day and at the very hour when Kleber was assassinated at Cairo, Desire was killed by a cannonball at Marengo. The emperor's method of dictating. October the 1st, 3rd. The wind, the sea, and the temperature still continued without variation. The westerly wind, which had at first been so much in our favour, now began to be adverse. We had taken an easterly direction, in the hope of falling in with the trade winds, but we now found ourselves to the leeward of the place of our destination, through the continuance of the westerly winds, a circumstance which surprised everybody and excited dissatisfaction among the crew. The emperor every morning regularly continued his dictation, in which he daily took a deeper interest. Consequently, his hours henceforth seemed less tedious. The vessel had been sent so hurriedly out of port that many repairs remained to be completed after we had put to sea, and the painting of the ship had only recently been finished. The emperor's sense of smelling is extremely delicate, and he found the paint so extremely offensive that he was forced to confine himself to his cabin for 2 days. Every evening, when taking his walk on deck, he loved to revert to the occupation of the morning. At first he was assisted by no other document than a wretched work entitled Guerre des Français en Italie, written without end or object, and devoid of any connected chronological plan. The emperor glanced through it, and his memory supplied all deficiencies. This faculty indeed appeared to me the more extraordinary, since it always seemed to be in readiness when needed, and as if at command. When the emperor commenced his daily dictations, he always complained that the circumstances to which he wished to recur were no longer familiar to him. After considering for a few moments, he would rise and walk about, and then begin to dictate. From that moment he was quite another man. Everything flowed smoothly. He spoke as if by inspiration, places, dates, phrases. He stopped at nothing. On the following day I read to him what he had dictated. After making the first correction, he continued to go on with the same subject, as though he had said nothing about it the day before. The difference between the first and the second version was very great. The latter was more positive and diffuse, and better arranged. Indeed, it sometimes materially differed from the first. On the day succeeding the first correction, the same operation was repeated, and the emperor commenced his third dictation for the purpose of setting the 2 former ones right. But after that, had he dictated a 4th, a 7th, or a 10th time, as he in some instances did, it would have been a repetition of precisely the same ideas, the same construction of phrases, and almost the same words. It was needless to take the trouble to write, though before his eyes he paid no attention to what was doing and continued to the end of his subject. It would have been vain to ask him to repeat anything that might not have been distinctly heard, and as he dictated with great rapidity, I never ventured to interrupt him, lest I should lose still more, and render him unable to recover the thread of the subject. A singular accident. 4th 7th. The continuance of the southwest wind was truly unfortunate. We were now going back instead of forward, and we had completely entered the Gulf of Guinea. There we perceived a ship with which we spoke. She proved to be a French ship, driven out of her course like ourselves. She had sailed from a port in Brittany and was bound for the Isle of Bourbon. The Emperor had been much distressed for want of books, and I jokingly said that perhaps I might have a box full on board that ship, as I had dispatched one to the Isle of Bourbon about 2 months previously. I spoke truly. Such is the caprice of chance. Had I been in quest of this ship, I might have traversed the ocean in vain. This was the identical vessel. I learned her name next day from the officer who had visited her. This officer strangely surprised the French captain by telling him that the Emperor Napoleon was on board the ship, which he then saw making way to St. Helena. The poor fellow shook his head sorrowfully and said, "You have robbed us of our treasure. You have taken away him who knew how to govern us according to our tastes and manners." Complaints of the crew against the Admiral. Examination of another work. Refutations. Reflections. 8th 11th. The weather continued obstinately settled. We every evening consoled ourselves for the unfavourable state of the day, with the hope of a change during the night, but we arose in the morning with the same disappointment. We had been almost within sight of the Congo, and we stood off. Everyone manifested discontent and ennui. The crew complained of the Admiral. Had he taken the usual course, said they, we should have reached our destination long before. His caprice, they observed, had led him, in spite of reason, to try an experiment, of which they knew not what might be the consequence. Their murmurs were not, however, so vehement as those raised against Christopher Columbus. We should not have been ill-pleased had he been reduced to the necessity of finding another St. Salvador in order to evade the crisis. Being for my own part fully occupied, this circumstance engrossed but little of my attention, and after all, one prison was as good as another. As to the Emperor, he was still more unconcerned by this delay. He merely looked upon it as so many days spent. 11. The Memoirs of Napoleon Bonaparte, by one who was constantly near him during 15 years, was the title of a work which I began to examine after the writings of Sir Robert Wilson. It is a volume of 300 pages, by an anonymous author, a circumstance in itself sufficient to inspire distrust at the first outset. But the composition and style of the work soon create more positive doubts in the mind of the reflecting reader, who is accustomed to judge of books. Finally, he who has seen and known but little of the Emperor will not hesitate to affirm that this work is a mere romance written at pleasure, that the author has never approached the Emperor, and that he is 100 leagues distant from his language, habits, and everything concerning him. The Emperor never said to a minister, "Count, do this, Count, execute that." Ambassadors never attended his levee. Napoleon could not, at 14 years of age, have made to a lady in company the reply attributed to him relative to the Vicomte de Turenne, because from the age of 10 to 18 he was attending the military school, where he could not possibly have been introduced to the company of ladies. It was not Perpignan who did not know him, but Dugommier, who had been his general, who recommended him in so marked a way to the Directory. It was a letter for restoring the democracy and not the Bourbons which an officer addressed to the first consul. The Emperor, who in Europe was universally acknowledged to have preserved the most impenetrable secrecy with regard to his plans and views, never indulged in gestures, and still less in monologues, which would have been likely to betray him, nor did his anger ever throw him into fits of insanity or epilepsy, an absurd fabrication which was long circulated in the saloons of Paris, but which was relinquished when it was found that those accidents never occurred on important occasions. These memoirs have unquestionably been an ordered work, the speculation of some bookseller who has furnished the title. Be this as it may, it might have been supposed that in adverting to a career so public as that of the Emperor and those who surrounded him, the author might have evinced more accuracy and knowledge of his subject. He is aware of his insufficiency on this head, and seeks to defend himself by saying that he was under the necessity of altering names, and that he did not wish to render certain portraits too striking. But he also observes this circumspection with regard to facts so that they are not recognizable. They are, for the most part, entirely the creations of his own fancy. Thus, the paper whose loss cost the general-in-chief so much anxiety in Egypt, the recommendation of the young Englishman who transported Bonaparte with joy by opening to him so brilliant a perspective of fortune at Constantinople, the melodrama of Malmaison, where the heroism of Madame Bonaparte, who is described as an absolute Amazon, so promptly secures the safety of her husband, may perhaps excite the interest of the reader, but they are only so many fables, and the story of Malmaison shows that the author knew no more of the character and disposition of the Empress Josephine than of those of the Emperor. The writer, however, by extolling certain traits, praising certain actions, and refuting certain falsehoods, assumes an air of impartiality, which, joined to his pretended situation near the Emperor during 15 years, produces a wonderful effect in the eyes of common readers. Most of the Englishmen on board the vessel looked upon this work as a kind of oracle. Their opinion was not changed on finding the Emperor's character so different from that attributed to him in this romance. They were inclined to believe that adversity and constraint had wrought an alteration in the Emperor, rather than to suppose that these printed statements were false. To my observations they constantly replied, "But the author was an impartial man, and one who was about the Emperor for 15 years. "But," said I, "what is this man's name? If he had personally injured you in his book, how could you bring him to justice? Anybody here might have written it." Those arguments were of course unanswerable, but the English found great difficulty in overcoming their first impressions, such are the common mass of readers, and such is the effect inevitably produced by printed falsehoods. But I shall no longer continue my examination of a work which is not deserving of farther notice. I therefore dispense with the remainder. On revising my manuscript in Europe, I found that public opinion had made such progress that I should be ashamed to waste time in refuting allegations and facts, which judgment and common sense have long since rejected, and which are now repeated only by fools. In endeavouring to subvert the erroneous notions which this author thought proper to create respecting the character of Napoleon, it will perhaps be thought that I should substitute my own opinions in their stead, but this I shall carefully avoid. I shall content myself with noting down all that I saw and heard. I will report his conversations, and nothing more must be expected. 12th the 13th. By dint of patience, and with the help of a few trifling variations, we gradually approached the termination of our voyage, and though deprived of the natural monsoon, we had now advanced within a short distance of our place of destination. As we continued our course, the weather gradually improved, and at length the wind became perfectly favourable, but this change did not take place until 24 hours before our arrival. 14th. The Admiral had previously informed us that he expected to come within sight of St. Helena this day. We had scarcely risen from table when our ears were saluted with the cry of "Land!" This was just within a quarter of an hour of the moment that had been fixed on. Nothing can better prove the advancement of navigation than this sort of miracle, by which seamen are enabled to foretell the hour at which they shall arrive at a particular point in the vast expanse. The Emperor went on the forecastle to see the island. He thought he perceived it, but I could see nothing. We lay to all night. Arrival at St. Helena. 15th. At daylight I had a tolerably near view of the island. At first I thought it rather extensive, but it seemed to diminish considerably as we approached. At length, about 70 days after our departure from England, and 110 after our departure from Paris, we cast anchor about noon. This was the first link of the chain that was to bind the modern Prometheus to his rock. We found at anchor several of the vessels of our squadron which had separated from us, or which we had left behind. They had, however, arrived several days before us, another proof of the extreme uncertainty attending nautical calculations. The Emperor, contrary to custom, dressed early and went upon deck. He went forward on the gangway to view the island. We beheld a kind of village surrounded by numerous barren and naked hills towering to every platform, every aperture, the brow of every hill was planted with cannon. The Emperor viewed the prospect through his glass. I stood behind him. My eyes were constantly fixed on his countenance, in which I could perceive no change, and yet he saw before him, perhaps his perpetual prison, perhaps his grave. How much, then, remained for me to feel and to witness? The Emperor soon left the deck. He desired me to come to him, and we proceeded to our usual occupation. The admiral, who had gone ashore very early, returned about 6 o'clock, much fatigued. He had been walking about various parts of the island, and at length thought he had found a habitation that would suit us. The place, however, stood in need of repairs, which might occupy 2 months. We had now been confined to our wooden dungeon for nearly 3 months, and the precise instructions of the ministers were that we should be detained there until our prison on shore was ready for our reception. The admiral, to do him justice, was incapable of such barbarity, he informed us, at the same time betraying a sort of inward satisfaction that he would take upon himself the responsibility of putting us ashore next day. Our residence at Briars, from the 16th of October, 1815, the day of our landing at St. Helena, to the 9th of December, the day preceding that of our removal to Longwood. An interval of a month and 24 days, landing of the Emperor at St. Helena, October 16th. After dinner, the Emperor, accompanied by the Grand Marshal, got into a boat to go ashore. By a remarkable and irresistible impulse, the officers all assembled on the quarterdeck, and the greater part of the crew on the gangways. This was not the effect of curiosity which an acquaintance of 3 months' duration could not fail to have removed, and which was now succeeded by the liveliest interest. The Emperor, before he stepped into the boat, sent for the captain of the vessel, and took leave of him, desiring him at the same time to convey his thanks to the officers and crew. These words appeared to produce a great sensation on all by whom they were understood, or to whom they were interpreted. The remainder of the Emperor's suite landed about 8 o'clock. We were accompanied by several of the officers, and everyone on board seemed to be sincerely affected at our departure. We found the Emperor in the apartment which had been assigned to him. A few minutes after our arrival, he went upstairs to his chamber, where we were called to attend him. His situation here was no better than it had been on board the vessel. We found ourselves lodged in a sort of inn or hotel. The town of St. Helena consists only of one very short street, or row of houses, built along a very narrow valley, formed between 2 hills, on the summit of a barren rock. The Emperor fires his abode at Briars. Description of the place. Miserable situation. 17th. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the Emperor, the Grand Marshal, and the Admiral rode out on horseback to visit Longwood, a house which had been chosen for the Emperor's residence, and was more than 2 leagues from the town. On their return, they saw a small villa situated in the valley about 2 miles from the town. The Emperor was extremely reluctant to return to the place where he had passed the preceding night, and where he felt himself more completely secluded from the world than he had been when on board the vessel. What with the sentinels who guarded his doors, and the crowds of persons whom curiosity had attracted beneath his windows, he had been obliged to confine himself to his chamber. A small pavilion, attached to the villa above mentioned, pleased him, and the Admiral was of opinion that he would be more agreeably situated there than in the town. In this place, therefore, the Emperor fixed his residence, and immediately sent for me. He had become so much interested in his work on the campaigns of Italy that he could not suspend it. I immediately proceeded to join him. The little valley, in which the village of St. Helena is situated, extends to a considerable distance up the island, winding along between 2 chains of barren hills which enclose it on either side. A good carriage road runs through this valley to the distance of about 2 miles, after which it is traced along the brow of the hill which rises on the left, while nothing but precipices and gulfs are discoverable on the right. The rugged aspect of the country here gradually diminishes, and the road opens on a small level height, on which are several houses interspersed with trees and different kinds of vegetation. This is a little oasis amidst the rocky desert. Here is situated the modest residence of Mr. Balcom, a merchant of the island. At the distance of 30 or 40 paces from the dwelling-house, on a pointed eminence, stood a little summer-house or pavilion, to which, in fine weather, the family were accustomed to retire to take tea and amuse themselves. This was the obscure retreat hired by the Admiral as the temporary residence of the Emperor, and he took possession of it in the morning. As I was ascending the winding path leading to the pavilion, I thought I perceived the Emperor and stopped to look at him. It was Napoleon himself. His body was slightly bent and his hands behind his back. He wore his usual neat and simple uniform and his celebrated little hat. He was standing at the threshold of the door when I advanced to salute him. "Ah," said he, "here you are. Why have you not brought your son?" "Sire," I replied, "the respect, the consideration I owe you prevented me." "Oh, you must learn to dispense with that," continued he. "Bring your son to me." In none of his campaigns, perhaps in no situation of his past life, had the emperor been so wretchedly lodged or subject to so many privations. The summer house contained one room nearly square on the ground floor, having 2 doors facing each other on 2 of its sides, and 2 windows on each of the other sides. These windows had neither curtains nor shutters, and there was scarcely a seat in the room. The emperor was at this moment alone. His 2 valets de chambre were bustling about to prepare his bed. He took a fancy to walk a little, but there was no level ground on any side of the pavilion, which was surrounded by huge pieces of stone and rock. He took my arm and began to converse in a cheerful strain. Night was advancing, profound silence, undisturbed solitude, prevailed on every side. What a crowd of sensations and sentiments overwhelmed me at this moment. I was in this desert, tete-a-tete, and enjoying familiar conversation with the man who had ruled the world, with Napoleon. What were my feelings? But to understand them, it would be necessary to revert to the days of his past glory, to the time when one of his decrees sufficed to subvert thrones and create kings. It would be necessary to reflect on what he was to all who surrounded him at the Tuileries, the timid embarrassment, the profound respect with which he was approached by his ministers and officers, the anxiety, the dread of ambassadors, princes, and even kings. With me, all those sentiments remained in full force. When the emperor was about to retire to rest, we found that one of the windows, which, as I have already observed, had neither shutters nor curtains, was close upon his bed, nearly on a level with his face. We barricaded it as well as we could, so as to exclude the air, of the effects of which the emperor is very susceptible, the least draught being sufficient to give him cold or the toothache. For my part, I ascended to the upper story, immediately above the emperor's room. In this place, the dimensions of which were about 7 square feet, there was only a bed and not a single chair. This served as a lodging for me and my son, for whom a mattress was spread out upon the floor. But how could we complain, being so near the emperor? We could hear the sound of his voice and distinguish his words. The valets de chambre slept on the ground, across by the door, wrapped up in their cloaks. Such is the faithful description of the first night which Napoleon passed at Briars. Description of Briars. The garden. The emperor meets the young ladies of the house. 18th. I breakfasted with the emperor. He had neither tablecloth nor plates, and the remains of the preceding day's dinner were brought to him for breakfast. The English officer was lodged in the neighbouring house as our guard, and 2 inferior officers marched up and down with an air of military parade before our eyes, for the purpose of watching our motions. Breakfast being over, the emperor proceeded to his dictation, which occupied him some hours. He afterwards took a fancy to explore our new domain and to take a view of the surrounding grounds. Descending our hillock on the side facing the principal house, we found a path bordered by a hedge and running at the foot of precipices. After walking along the path to the distance of 200 paces, we arrived at a little garden, the door of which was open. This garden is long and narrow, and formed on very uneven ground, but a tolerably level walk extends the whole length of it. At the entrance there is a sort of arbour at one extremity, and at the other are 2 huts for the negroes whose business it is to look after the garden. It contains some fruit trees and a few flowers. We had no sooner entered the garden than we were met by the daughters of the master of the house, girls about 14 or 15 years of age, the one sprightly, giddy, and caring for nothing, the other more sedate, but at the same time possessing great naivete of manner. Both speak a little French. They had walked through the garden and put all the flowers under contribution to present them to the emperor, whom they overwhelmed with the most whimsical and ridiculous questions. The emperor was much amused by this familiarity, to which he was so little accustomed. "We have been to a masked ball," said he, when the young ladies had taken their leave. The youth of France. The emperor visits Mr. Balcomb's house, 19th-20th. The emperor invited my son to breakfast. It may be easily imagined that he was greatly overjoyed at this honour. It was, perhaps, the first time he had ever been so near the emperor or had spoken to him, and he was not a little flurried on the occasion. The table still remained without a cloth. The breakfast continued to be brought from the town, and consisted of only 2 or 3 wretched dishes. Today a chicken was brought. The emperor wished to carve it himself and to help us. He was astonished at finding that he succeeded so well. It was long, he said, since he had done so much. For all his politeness, he added, had been lost in the business and cares of his generalship of Italy. Coffee is almost a necessary of life to the emperor, but here it proved so bad that on tasting it he thought himself poisoned. He sent it away, and made me send away mine also. The emperor was at this moment using a snuff-box set with several ancient medals, which were surrounded by Greek inscriptions. The emperor, not being certain of the name of one of the heads, asked me to translate the inscription, and on my replying that it was beyond my powers, he laughed and said, "I see you are no better scholar than myself." My son then tremblingly undertook the task, and read Mithridates, Demetrius, Poliorcetes, and some other names. The extreme youth of my son, and this circumstance, attracted the emperor's attention. "Is your son so far advanced?" said he, and he began to question him at great length respecting his lyceum, his masters, his lessons. Then turning to me, "What a rising generation I leave behind me," said he. "This is all my work. The merits of the French youth will be a sufficient revenge to me. On beholding the work, all must render justice to the workman, and the perverted judgment or bad faith of declaimers must fall before my deeds. If I had thought only of myself, and securing my own power, as has been continually asserted, I should have endeavoured to hide learning under a bushel, instead of which I devoted myself to the propagation of knowledge. And yet the youth of France have not enjoyed all the benefits which I intended they should. My university, according to the plan I had conceived, was a masterpiece in its combinations, and would have been such in its national results. But an evil-disposed person spoiled all, and in so doing he was actuated by the worst of feelings, and doubtless by a calculation of consequences. In the evening the emperor went to visit our neighbours. Mr. Balcom, who was suffering under a fit of the gout, lay stretched on a sofa. His wife and the two young ladies whom we had met in the morning were beside him. The masked ball was resumed again with great spirit. Our guests liberally dealt out all their store of knowledge. The conversation turned on novels. One of the young ladies had read Madame Cottin's Mathieude, and was delighted to find that the emperor was acquainted with the work. An Englishman, with a great round face, to all appearance a true vacuum plenum, who had been listening earnestly, in order to turn his little knowledge of French to the best account, modestly ventured to ask the emperor whether the princess, the friend of Matilda, whose character he particularly admired, was still living. The emperor, with a very solemn air, replied, "No, sir. She is dead and buried," and he was almost tempted to believe he was himself hoaxed when he found that the melancholy tidings drew tears from the great staring eyes of the Englishman. The young ladies evinced no less simplicity, though in them it was more pardonable. However, I was led to conclude that they had not studied chronology very deeply. One of them, turning over Florian's Estelle to show us that she could read French, happened to light on the name of Gaston de Foix, and finding him distinguished by the title of general, she asked the emperor whether he had been satisfied with his conduct in the army, whether he had escaped the dangers of war, and whether he was still living. 21st. In the morning the admiral came to visit the emperor. He knocked at the door, and had I not been present, the emperor must have been reduced to the alternative of opening it himself, or suffering the admiral to wait on the outside. All the scattered members of our little colony likewise came from the town, and we were for a short time collected together. Each described the wretchedness of his situation, and received the sympathy of the emperor. Horror and misery of our situation. The emperor's indignation. Note to the English government. 23rd, 24th. The English ministers, in violating the rights of hospitality, to which we had trusted with such implicit confidence, seem to have omitted nothing to make us feel this violation the more bitterly. By banishing us to the farther extremity of the world, and reducing us to every kind of privation and ill treatment, they wish to make us drain the cup of misery to the very dregs. St. Helena is a true Siberia. The only difference is its limited extent, and the climate being warm instead of cold. The Emperor Napoleon, who but lately possessed such boundless power and disposed of so many crowns, now occupies a wretched hovel, a few feet square, perched upon a rock, unprovided with furniture, and without either shutters or curtains to the windows. This place must serve him for bedchamber, dressing-room, dining-room, study, and sitting-room, and he is obliged to go out when it is necessary to have this one apartment cleaned. His meals, consisting of a few wretched dishes, are brought to him from a distance, as though he were a criminal in a dungeon. He is absolutely in want of the necessaries of life, The bread and wine are not such as we have been accustomed to, and are so bad that we loathe to touch them. Water, coffee, butter, oil, and other articles are either not to be procured, or are scarcely fit for use. A bath, which is so necessary to the emperor's health, is not to be had, and he is deprived of the exercise of riding on horseback. His friends and servants are 2 miles distant from him, and are not suffered to approach his person without being accompanied by a soldier. They are deprived of their arms, and are compelled to pass the night at the guardhouse, if they return beyond a certain hour, or if any mistake occurs in the password, which happens almost daily. Thus, on the summit of this frightful rock, we are equally exposed to the severity of man and the rigour of nature. And how easy would it have been to procure us a more suitable retreat and more courteous usage? Assuredly, if the sovereigns of Europe decreed this exile, private enmity has directed its execution. If policy alone dictated this measure as indispensable, would it not have been essential, in order to render the fact evident to the world, to have surrounded with every kind of respect and consideration the illustrious victim, with regard to whom it had been found necessary to violate law and principle? We were all assembled round the emperor, and he was recapitulating these facts with warmth. "For what infamous treatment are we reserved?" he exclaimed. "This is the anguish of death. To injustice and violence they now add insult and protracted torment. If I were so hateful to them, why did they not get rid of me? A few musket balls in my heart or my head would have done the business, and there would at least have been some energy in the crime. Were it not for you, and above all for your wives, I would receive from them nothing but the pay of a private soldier. How can the monarchs of Europe permit the sacred character of sovereignty to be violated in my person? Do they not see that they are, with their own hands, working their own destruction at St. Helena? I entered their capitals victorious, and had I cherished such sentiments, what would have become of them? They styled me their brother, and I had become so by the choice of the people, the sanction of victory, the character of religion, and the alliances of their policy and their blood. Do they imagine that the good sense of nations is blind to their conduct, and what do they expect from it? At all events, make your complaints, gentlemen. Let indignant Europe hear them. Complaints from me would be beneath my dignity and character. I must command, or be silent." Next morning, an officer, gently opening the door, introduced himself, without farther ceremony, into the emperor's room, where I was engaged with him. He had come, however, with good intentions. He was the captain of one of the small vessels which had formed our squadron, was now about to return to Europe, and came to inquire whether the emperor had any commands. Napoleon immediately recurred to the subject of our conversation on the preceding evening, and, becoming animated by degrees, gave utterance to sentiments of the loftiest and most energetic character, which he charged him to communicate to the British government. I interpreted what he said in the same spirit and with great rapidity. The officer seemed astonished at what he heard, and left us with a promise punctually to fulfil his commission. But he could not have described the expression, and particularly the tone, of which I was a witness. The emperor, however, directed me to make a memorandum of what he had said, which the officer must have found very feebly expressed compared with what he had just heard. The note was as follows: Memorandum. The emperor desires, by the return of the next vessel, to receive some account of his wife and son, and to be informed whether the latter is still living. He takes this opportunity of repeating and conveying to the British government the protestations which he has already made against the extraordinary measures adopted towards him. First, that government has declared him a prisoner of war. The emperor is not a prisoner of war. His letter to the Prince Regent, which he wrote and communicated to Captain Maitland before he went on board the Bellerophon, sufficiently proves to the whole world the resolutions and the sentiments of confidence which induced him freely to place himself under the English flag. The emperor might, had he pleased, have agreed to quit France only on stipulated conditions with regard to himself, but he disdained to mingle personal considerations with the great interests with which his mind was constantly occupied. He might have placed himself at the disposal of the Emperor Alexander, who had been his friend, or of the Emperor Francis, who was his father-in-law. But, confiding in the justice of the English nation, he desired no other protection than its laws afforded, and, renouncing public affairs, he sought no other country than that which was governed by fixed laws, independent of private will. 2. Second, had the emperor really been a prisoner of war, the rights which civilized governments possess over such a prisoner are limited by the law of nations and terminate with the war itself. 3. Nend. If the English government considered the emperor, though arbitrarily, as a prisoner of war, the right of that government was then limited by public law, or else, as there existed no cartel between the two nations during the war, it might have adopted towards him the principles of savages who put their prisoners to death. This proceeding would have been more humane and more conformable to justice than that of sending him to this horrible rock. Death inflicted on board the Bellerophon in the Plymouth roads would have been a blessing compared with the treatment to which he is now subjected. We have travelled over the most desolate countries of Europe, but none is to be compared with this barren rock. Deprived of everything that can render life supportable, it is calculated only to renew perpetually the anguish of death. The first principles of Christian morality, and that great duty imposed on man to pursue his fate, whatever it may be, may withhold him from terminating with his own hand a wretched existence. The emperor glories in being superior to such a feeling. But if the British ministers should persist in their course of injustice and violence towards him, he would consider it a happiness if they would put him to death. The vessel which sailed for Europe with this document was the Redpole, Captain Desmond. The reader must pardon the insipid monotony of our complaints. They will be found to be always the same, no doubt. But let it be remembered how much more pain must have been felt in repeating them than can possibly be experienced in their perusal. Mode of living at Briars. Cabinet which the emperor had with him at Austerlitz. The emperor's large cabinet. Its contents. Articles of vertu. Labels against Napoleon. Infamous conduct of persons at the Tuileries. 25th, 27th. The emperor dressed very early. He took a short walk out of doors. We breakfasted about 10 o'clock. He walked again, and then we proceeded to business. I read to him what he had dictated on the preceding evening, and which my son had copied in the morning. He corrected it, and then continued his dictation. We went out again about 5 o'clock, and returned at 6, the hour appointed for dinner. That is to say, if the dinner should be brought from the town by that time. The days were very long, and the evenings still longer. Unfortunately, I did not understand chess. At one time I had an idea of studying it by night, but where could I find a teacher? I pretended to a little knowledge of piquet, but the emperor soon discovered my ignorance. He gave me credit for my good intentions, yet he gave up playing. Want of occupation would sometimes lead him to the neighbouring house, where the young ladies made him play at whist. But his more usual practice was to remain at table after dinner, and to converse sitting in his chair, for the room was too small to admit of his walking about. One evening he ordered a little travelling cabinet to be brought to him, and after minutely examining every part of it, he presented it to me, saying, "I have had it in my possession a long time. I made use of it on the morning of the Battle of Austerlitz. It must go to young Emmanuel," said he, turning to my son. "When he is 30 or 40 years old, we shall be no more. This will but enhance the value of the gift. He will say when he shows it, 'The Emperor Napoleon gave this to my father at St. Helena.'" I received the precious gift with a kind of reverential feeling, and I preserve it as a valuable relic. Passing from that to the examination of a large cabinet, he looked over some portraits of his own family and some presents which he had personally received. These consisted of the portraits of Madame, of the Queen of Naples, of the daughters of Joseph, of his brothers, of the King of Rome. An Augustus and Olivia, both exceedingly rare, a countenance of Scipio, and another antique of immense value given to him by the Pope, a Peter the Great on a box, another box with a Charles V, another with a Turenne, and some, which were in daily use, covered with a collection of medallions of Caesar, Alexander, Sylla, Mithridates. Next came some snuff-boxes, ornamented with his own portrait set in diamonds. He then looked for one without diamonds, and not finding it, he called his valet de chambre to inquire about it. Unfortunately, this portrait still remained in the town, along with the greater part of his effects. I felt mortified at receiving this intelligence. I could not help thinking that I had been a loser by this mischance. The emperor then examined several snuff-boxes which Louis XVIII had left on his table at the Tuileries at the time of his precipitate departure. On one of these were represented on a black ground the portraits of Louis XVI, of the Queen, and of Madame Elizabeth, executed in paste in imitation of ivory and fantastically arranged. They formed 3 crescents placed back to back in the shape of an equilateral triangle, and groups of cherubs closely interwoven composed the external border. Another box presented a watercolor sketch of a hunt, which had no other claim to merit than the circumstance of its being attributed to the pencil of the Duchess of Angoulême. A third was surmounted with a portrait, which appeared to be that of the Countess de Provence. These 3 boxes were of simple and even ordinary execution, and could possess no other value than that which their history attaches to them. On the Emperor's arrival in Paris on the evening of the 20th of March, he found the king's study precisely in the state in which it had been used. All his papers still remained on the tables. By the Emperor's desire, these tables were pushed into the corners of the apartment and others brought. He gave orders that nothing should be touched, intending to examine the papers at his leisure, and as the Emperor himself quitted France without returning to the Tuileries, the king must have found his study and his papers nearly as he had left them. The Emperor took a hasty glance at some of the papers. He found among them several letters from the king to M. d'Avaray at Madeira, where the latter died. They were written in the king's own hand, and had doubtless been sent back to him. He found also some confidential letters of the king, likewise in his own hand. But how came they there? How had they been returned to him? That would be difficult to explain. They consisted of 5 or 6 pages, written in very elegant language, and displaying some sense, but very abstract and metaphysical. In one of them the prince said to the lady whom he addressed, "Judge, madame, how much I love you. I have left off mourning for your sake." And here, said the Emperor, the idea of mourning was followed up by a succession of long paragraphs, quite in an academic style. The Emperor could not imagine to whom it had been written, or what the mourning alluded to. I could not assist his conjectures on either of these points. 2 or 3 days after the Emperor had replaced a certain individual at the head of a celebrated institution, he found on one of the tables a memoir from that very person, which, from the terms in which it was couched with reference to himself and the whole of his family, would certainly have prevented him from signing the reappointment. There were also many other documents of the same nature, but the most complete records of baseness, deceit, and villainy were found in the apartments of M. Blacas, Grand Master of the Wardrobe, and Minister of the Household. These were filled with plans, reports, and petitions of every kind. There were few of these papers in which the writers did not put themselves forward at the expense of Napoleon, whom they were far from expecting to return. They formed altogether such a mass that the Emperor was obliged to appoint a committee of 4 persons to examine them. He now thinks he was to blame in not having confided that office to a single individual, and with such injunctions that he might have felt confident nothing was suffered to escape. He has since had reason to believe that these papers might have afforded some salutary hints respecting the treachery which surrounded him on his return from Waterloo. Among the rest, there was a long letter from one of the female attendants of the Princess Pauline. This voluminous letter was expressed in very coarse language with regard to the princess and her letters, and described the Emperor, to whom the writer always alluded under the title of that man, in the worst possible colours. This had not been thought sufficient. Part of it had been erased and interlined by another hand, in order to bring forward Napoleon in the most scandalous manner, and on the margin, in the hand of the interlineator, were written the words, "fit to be printed." A few days afterwards, probably, this libel was published. An upstart woman held a distinguished rank in the state, and who had been overwhelmed with acts of kindness from the Emperor, wrote in a great hurry to her friend to acquaint her with the famous decision of the Senate respecting the forfeiture and proscription of Napoleon. The letter contained the following: "My dear friend, my husband has just returned. He is tired to death, but his efforts have carried it. We are delivered from that man, and we shall have the Bourbons. Thank God, we shall now be real countesses." Among these papers, Napoleon experienced the mortification to meet with some containing very improper remarks respecting himself personally, and those too in the very handwriting of individuals who only the day before had assembled round him and were already in the enjoyment of his favours. The first impulse of his indignation was to determine that they should be printed, and to withdraw his protection. A second thought restrained him. "We are so volatile, so inconstant, so easily led away," said he, "that after all I could not be certain that those very people had not really and spontaneously come back to my service. In that case, I should have been punishing them at the very time when they were returning to their duty. I thought it better to seem to know nothing of the matter, and I ordered all their letters to be burnt. The Emperor commences the campaign of Egypt with the Grand Marshal. Anecdotes of Brumaire. Letter of the Count de Lille. The beautiful Duchess de Guiche. 28th-31st. My son and I prosecuted our labours without intermission. His health, however, began to be affected. He felt a pain in his chest. My eyes also grew weak. These were really the effects of our excessive occupation. Indeed, we had gone through an amazing quantity of work. We had already nearly arrived at the end of the campaign of Italy. The emperor, however, did not yet find that he had sufficient occupation. Employment was his only resource, and the interest which his first dictations had assumed furnished an additional motive for proceeding with them. The campaign of Egypt was now about to be commenced. The emperor had frequently talked of employing the Grand Marshal on this subject. Those of our party who were lodged in the town were badly accommodated and were dissatisfied at being separated from the emperor. They were harassed by the constraint and mortifications to which they were subjected. I suggested to the emperor that he should set us to work altogether and proceed at once with the campaigns of Italy and Egypt, the history of the consulate, the return from the island of Elba. The time, I observed, would then pass more quickly. The great work, the glory of France, would advance more rapidly, and the gentlemen who resided in the town would be less unhappy. The idea pleased the emperor, and from that moment 1 or 2 of his suite came regularly every day to write to his dictations, the transcript of which they brought to him next morning. They then stayed to dinner, and thus afforded the emperor a little more amusement than usual. We made such arrangements that the emperor insensibly found himself more comfortably situated in many respects. A tent, which had been given to me by the colonel of the 53rd Regiment, was spread out so as to form a prolongation of the room occupied by the emperor. Our cook took up his abode at Briar's. The table linen was taken from the trunks, the plate was set forth, and our first dinner after these preparations was a sort of fête. The evenings, however, always hung heavily on our hands. The emperor would sometimes visit the adjoining house. At other times he would endeavour to leave his chamber to walk, but more frequently he remained within doors, and tried to pass the time in conversation until 10 or 12 o'clock. He avoided retiring to bed too early, for when he did so he awoke in the night, and in order to divert his mind from sorrowful reflections, he was obliged to rise and read. One day at dinner, the emperor cast his eyes on one of the dishes of his own campaign service, on which the imperial arms were engraved. "How they have spoiled this!" he exclaimed emphatically, and he could not refrain from observing that the king had been in a great hurry to take possession of the imperial plate, which he certainly could not claim as his property, since it unquestionably belonged to him, for, he added, that when he ascended the throne he found not a vestige of royal property. At his abdication, he left to the crown 5 millions in plate, and between 40 and 50 millions in furniture, which was all his own property, purchased out of his civil list. In a conversation one evening, the emperor related the circumstances attending the event of Brumaire. I suppressed the particulars, because they were afterwards dictated to General Gourgaud, and a detailed account of this remarkable affair will be found in the memoirs. Sieyès, who was one of the provisional consuls along with Napoleon, astonished to hear his colleague, on the very first conference, discussing questions relative to finance, administration, the army, law, and politics, left him quite disconcerted, and ran to his friends, saying, "Gentlemen, you have got a master. This man knows everything, wants everything, and can do everything." I was in London at that time, and I told the emperor that the emigrants there had formed great hopes and placed much confidence on the events of the 18th of Brumaire, and on his consulate. Several of us, who had formerly been acquainted with Madame de Beauharnais, immediately set out for Paris, hoping, through her means, to exercise some influence or give some direction to affairs, which then appeared under a new aspect. Our general opinion at the time was that the first consul had waited for propositions from the French princes. We rested our hopes on the circumstance of his having been so long without coming to a decision respecting them, which, however, he did some time afterwards in a way the most overwhelming by means of a proclamation. We attributed this result to the stupid conduct of the Bishop of Arras, the counsellor and director of our affairs, who, according to his own confession, went to work with his eyes shut, and boasted of not having read a single newspaper for a series of years, ever since they had been filled, as he said, with the successful enterprises and the falsehoods of that wretched party. On the first establishment of the consulate, someone having attempted to persuade the bishop to enter into negotiations with the consul through the mediation of Madame Bonaparte, he rejected the proposition. with indignation and in language of so coarse and disgusting a nature as induced the person to tell him that his expressions were far from being episcopal, and that he certainly had never learnt them from his breviary. About the same period he made use of some gross invectives against the Duc de Choiseul, that too at the table of the prince, where he was smartly reprimanded for them, and all this was only because the Duke, on being released from imprisonment at Calais and escaping death through the protection of the consul, concluded his reply to the inquiries made by the prince relative to Bonaparte by protesting that, for his part, he should never cease to acknowledge his personal gratitude towards him. To all this the emperor replied that he had never bestowed a thought on the princes, but the observations to which I had alluded proceeded from one of the other consuls, and were made without any particular motive, that we who were abroad seemed to have no idea of the opinions of those at home, and that even if he had been favourably disposed towards the princes, it would not have been in his power to carry his intentions into execution. He had, however, received overtures about that period, both from Mitterrand and London. The king, he said, wrote him a letter which was conveyed to him by Lebrun, who had it from the Abbé de Montesquion, the secret agent of the prince at Paris. This letter, which was written in a very laboured style, contained the following paragraph: "You delay long to restore me my throne. It is to be feared that you may allow favourable moments to escape. You cannot complete the happiness of France without me, nor can I serve France without you. Hasten then and specify yourself the places which you would wish your friends to possess." To this letter the first consul replied, "I have received your Royal Highness's letter. I have always felt deep interest in your misfortunes and those of your family. You must not think of appearing in France. You could not do so without passing over 100,000 dead bodies. I shall, however, be always eager to do everything that may tend to alleviate your fate or enable you to forget your misfortunes." The overtures made by the Count d'Artois possessed still more elegance and address. He commissioned as the bearer of them the Duchesse de Guiche, a lady whose fascinating manners and personal graces were calculated to assist her in the important negotiation. She easily got access to Madame Bonaparte, with whom all the individuals of the old court came easily in contact, fasted with her at Malmaison, and the conversation turning on London, the emigrants, and the French princes, Madame de Guiche mentioned that as she happened a few days before to be at the house of the Count d'Artois, she had heard some person ask the prince what he intended to do for the first consul, in the event of his restoring the Bourbons, and that the prince had replied, "I would immediately make him constable of the kingdom, and everything else he might choose. But even that would not be enough. We would raise on the Carrousel a lofty and magnificent column, surmounted with a statue of Bonaparte crowning the Bourbons." As soon as the first consul entered, which he did very shortly after breakfast, Josephine eagerly repeated to him the circumstance which the Duchess had related. "And did you not reply," said her husband, "that the corpse of the first consul would have been made the pedestal of the column?" The charming Duchess was still present. The beauties of her countenance, her eyes, and her words were directed to the success of her commission. She said she was so delighted, she did not know how she should ever be able sufficiently to acknowledge the favour which Madame Bonaparte had procured her, of seeing and hearing so distinguished a man, so great a hero. It was all in vain. The Duchesse de Guiche received orders that very night to quit Paris. The charms of the emissary were too well calculated to alarm Josephine, to induce her to say anything urgent in her favour, and next day the Duchess was on her way to the frontier. It is, however, absolutely false that Napoleon, on his part, at a subsequent period, made overtures or propositions to the princes touching the cession of their rights or their renunciation of the crown, though such statements had been made in some pompous declarations, profusely circulated through Europe. "How was such a thing possible?" said the emperor. "I, who could only reign by the very principle which excluded them, that of the sovereignty of the people. How could I have sought to possess through them rights which were proscribed in their persons? That would have been to proscribe myself. The absurdity would have been too palpable, too ridiculous. It would have ruined me for ever in public opinion. The fact is that neither directly nor indirectly, at home or abroad, did I ever do anything of the kind.